the big problem for I would argue for the country, but certainly for the Conservatives of Nigel Farage as well. And this could not be better calculated, but to increase, his kind of core support as well.
Here we are with a special extra edition of the How to Win an Election podcast. Questions edition. I'm Matt Chorley, joined this morning by Mackenzie, Policy Mackenzie, former Director of Policy for Nick Clegg, who is here. Hello, Polly.
Hello, Matt.
Beaming in from somewhere, Tory brainbox, Daniel Finkelstein. Morning, Danny.
Where do you think I am, Matt? Pinner, of course. Yes. Beaming
and Peter Mandelson, New Labour mastermind, is not here because he's away on his travels. Maybe he should have returned early. Which seems to be all of the fashion right now. If you want to get in touch and send us a question, you can email howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. Where shall we start? What could possibly be the first question of the day? We've had absolutely loads of questions on the question of Rishi Sunak. Simon says, has anyone made more gaffs in an election campaign than Rishi Sunak? Would the Tories now be better off binning Sunak mid-campaign, says Peter. Colin says, surely today's episode has to be called How to Lose an Election. Lots of people making that suggestion. Danny, how serious is this, Rishi Sunak snubbing the D-Day veterans?
It's difficult to tell at this point. It's certainly not helpful, is it? And the problem is it attaches to a narrative. So the question that was interesting about when someone says, has anyone made more gaffs in election campaigns? Gaffs are sort of part of narratives, really. You can do exactly the same thing when you're doing really, really well, and they don't form part of a story. They don't adhere to you. That's not the problem he's got. And of course, we've got the big problem for I would argue for the country, but certainly for the Conservatives of Nigel Farage as well. And this could not be better calculated, but to increase his kind of core support as well. So it could be, could potentially, by amplifying the narrative, create momentum. As you know, I'm not like a huge believer that these kind of ups and downs alter all that much. But as I've said before, sometimes you have noise and you have signal, and sometimes noise can kind of coincide with an election campaign. So this is an example of it. I think truth of it is Rishi Sunak is not very strong at kind of the kind of symbols of political leadership, and this is an illustration of that. And symbols of political leadership are important. So clearly this was a miscalculation. It's so much easier to spot a miscalculation after you've made it and someone's pointed it out than it is in advance. And I know that from experience. So I'm deeply sympathetic to those people who are involved in the decision, but it was a mistake.
I think, a less sympathetic because, I'm just thinking about when Jeremy Corbyn was criticised for days, if not weeks, for wearing an insufficiently smart jacket at the cenotaph. And if you've been involved in politics at all, you have to know that you cannot take the sort of the honouring of veterans too seriously. You should always take the risk that you are being too sort of serious and grand and symbolic about it. And so I'm afraid I just can't understand, and the briefing this morning seems to be that he was originally planning not to go at all. And,
so we should be glad he went.
Well, I mean, we should actually, because not only does it matter in an election campaign, it also actually matters. It actually matters for European solidarity. And, Zelensky was involved, because Europe needs to be unified against a genuine threat right now. So the thought that a prime minister wouldn't be there, even if there wasn't an election, strikes me as, just genuinely, deeply, deeply surprising. And these things are so minutely planned when you've got that many world leaders, right, as to who's going to stand where and who's going to leave first and walk first. So you would absolutely know in advance who else is going to be there. You know that everyone else is going to have their head of government, and then you've sent David Cameron. I mean, that is a deliberate choice. I think it's very surprising, and I think it exposes a real flank ahead of the this sort of 7-way debate tonight, where Nigel Farage will be there, Penny Mordaunt will be, representing the Conservatives. I mean, Rishi Sunak needed to apologise this morning, because otherwise Penny Mordaunt would have been in the impossible position of either trying to defend him, which I'm sure she would have refused to do, or to say that he should have apologised, which would of course been completely incomprehensible.
I completely understand it, and certainly if you look, I completely understand what Polly said, and certainly if you looked at cold, it does seem incomprehensible political error, and perhaps it was, right? But obviously they made it, and so and I just observe that I'm always much better at seeing these political errors after they happen than I probably was when I was involved in it, preventing them. That's all I'm really saying, so that I'm sort of personally sympathetic, but clearly it was a political error. Now, I would point out, in terms of narrative terms, people are still going on about the fact that Margaret Thatcher chose to go to an EU or to a world leaders summit in France in the middle of her own leadership.
Of course, yeah. And
so if you are seen as being someone who's under pressure, making a lot of political errors, almost everything you do can end up looking like an error. But at the same time, I completely agree. I mean, obviously he's had to apologise. It clearly was an error, and it does look to me like something that you probably could have sat down and avoided.
At the very least, he could have just decided yesterday when he was there. He'd have just said, "I'm not going back to speak to Paul Brand from ITV News."
I completely understand it.
He's a delight, of course.
He's a lovely man, but you could have done it on a different day.
I note that I'm just, the only thing I'm adding in is, with these incomprehensible errors, you obviously, people make these errors and you think, how on earth did they manage to do that? And all I'm saying is, when you're there and it goes by fast afterwards, you think, oh my goodness, I should have stopped that, or I should have spoken at that point, or how did we let the machine of everybody just do something without thinking about it? And that's how those things happen. But, you shouldn't make them. Tony Blair, for example, almost never made them, did very occasionally do so. Deciding to make a political speech to the Women's Institute was clearly such an error. But so you can occasionally
stick in the mind, and I suppose because this is an election campaign already, when he's on the back foot, to put it politely. Right. Anyway, let's move on, because we've had loads and loads of questions. Somebody mentioned Canada in the Conservative wipeout there. We've actually had a question in from Canada.
Hi, Matt and team. I've been enjoying the podcast since day one, and dare I say I'm your biggest Canadian fan. I'm overcome with election fever and will be glued to all the election coverage over the next month. Now, my question is about the local races taking place in each constituency. As a former constituency staffer myself, I know a lot of politicians who talk about being good constituency politicians. Now, besides the moral implications, does being a good constituency politician actually move the dial? Or does your re-election really depend on if you're in a safe or a marginal seat? Thanks, and all the best from Thunder Bay.
That's Stephen Margaret from Thunder Bay in Canada. Hello, Stephen. If you are a Canadian listener and you want to lay claim to being the biggest Canadian fan of How to Win, do get in touch. Now, it's interesting, this, Polly, because you've got, the candidates have been confirmed today. 5 o'clock, we'll get the final list. This question of good constituency MP, I can buck the trend. Are we slightly over-egged by MPs, do you think?
It certainly appeals to, your sense of ego, doesn't it? The sense that I am beloved, and the reason that I've got this majority is because of me. I think it does make a difference, but it makes a difference absolutely at the margin. And it makes more of a difference if you are a minority party. It was certainly absolutely core to the Liberal Democrat growth between sort of 92 and then 2010 was actually, and a bit less in 2010, 2005, really, because where you sort of knew where politics was going. So you could just run a campaign that said, well, we're not going to be the government, but what you want is a good local MP. But even then, as we saw in 2015, lots of Liberal Democrats and felt that, we knew we would lose a lot of seats, but lots of people felt that we would hold on to more than the polls suggested, because there were MPs who were just so deeply embedded in their place, in their community, and had built up a personal following. But, that personal following can be absolutely wiped away by the tide. One minor point, though, is, you won't know because he was doing his Morrissey impression, but my husband is in fact Canadian and may I don't know, I haven't asked him technically if he's a fan of the podcast, but I'd like to hope so.
He re-recorded the theme music. That's quite fan-like behaviour.
But maybe he and Stephen can have the debate together.
Yeah, let's get them on. Danny, what do you think of this? And actually, because it got me thinking, talking about the good local working local MP. William Hague's column in the Times earlier this week talking about how all parties seem to be making a real virtue of local people, former councillors and so on. And he was saying actually that was a mistake because what you want is people who want to lead the country, not people who want to run the council.
So, there's a famous true story of the encounter between Margaret Thatcher and the later Conservative chairman, Jeremy Hanley, but after he'd won his marginal seat. These figures are not exactly the right ones, but he spoke to her and said, Mrs. Thatcher, I just want to say I got 16,105 votes in my constituency. I won by 105, and I wanted to say, because you came down to the constituency, you are responsible for those 105 votes. And she responded, no, Jeremy, you are responsible for the 105 votes. I am responsible for the 16,000. So, as I say, those are not exactly the right figures, but they are something like them. So I think actually that captures the right wisdom. Essentially, the swing takes everything. And in this election, people will win or lose, like Polly said, win or lose elections depending on the swing. But there is a small margin that accords to local members. And occasionally, if you're in a situation like Jeremy Corbyn is, for example, where you've been excluded by your party and you're running against it, sometimes a really stellar constituency reputation, which I think he does have, might lead you to be able to win against all the odds. And so, there was an example of that in 1983 for the SDP. A man called John Cartwright won in Woolwich, which is an extraordinary thing to do for the SDP, given the class composition that later took up the SDP. And he managed to win his seat because he had this incredible reputation as a local MP. But generally speaking, it's particularly apparently relevant when you've done your first term as an incumbent. You bake in a certain amount of extra votes, and after that it tends to, it doesn't tend to increase that much, but you can buck the trend a bit, but not much. And we're talking about very, very large swings in this election, so perhaps at the margin a few people might survive because of their local reputation at the margin of their results, but it won't be much.
We'll see. We'll see. We won't know until after the election. We've had a question from Canada. Let's go now to Australia.
G'day, Cobbers. I'm a fan from Down Under here in Sydney, Australia. I'm interested in both UK and Aussie politics, and I've been struck by the similarities and the differences. I've noticed a lot of political strategists have worked across both countries, such as Sir Linton Crosby, Isaac Levadio, Alan Milburn, and John McTernan, just to name a few. Have any of you investigated Aussie politics for strategies, ideas, or policy? Have any of these worked in a UK context? And how do you perceive Australian politics compared to the UK? Thank you. P.S. I'd never heard of Danny Finkelstein before I discovered this podcast, and I'm a big fan and have ordered your book. Keep up the good work. Cheers, David.
That's David in Australia. That suggests he had heard of Polly and Peter, which is nice.
Everybody's heard of me.
Clearly big Down Under. Danny, why is it? Is it language? Is it because socially we're similar? Why is this? It was quite interesting when you laid it all out, this overlap between British and Australian politics.
Well, the first person that came over and did that was a man called Andrew Robb, who helped in the Conservative campaign. I remember him coming in to tell John Major that we were done for, although he used a more Australian word than done in the forthcoming election. And then I actually introduced Michael Howard after that to Linton Crosby, and the reason for that is they have a constituency system, and there's also the kind of linguistic barriers, and also because the Conservative Party in Britain was going through a period where kind of it wanted the slightly more robust political language that was quite common to the Australians, and the Australian Liberals were doing very well. All of those were quite attractive. A big difference is that you can use television advertising in Australia, so you can produce if you manage to focus your message, you can move things quite a lot faster as you get closer to the election. But yeah, there are lots of strategies that work in Australian elections, better the devil you know type of strategies. And certainly, I suppose for a lot of leaders who think of themselves as being comeback kids and uncharismatic, John Howard's victories were quite enticing.
Have you ever?
I'm mildly terrified by Australian politics, really. The gloves are off, but also everyone's wearing knuckle dusters, kind of linguistically at least. It's a very strange, kind of brutal political system. Something I find really interesting is there's been polling done, but, if you're trying to sell a policy in the UK, it really works to say we should do this like they do in Australia. Australia has a great reputation. Whereas if you say we should do this because they do it in Slovenia, or we should do it because this is the way it's done in France, people don't like that. They don't want to copy France. But people, it's a real boost to almost any policy suggestion is to say like they do in Australia.
Australian points-based system. Nobody knew what that meant, but it's had Australia in it, so that sounded good.
Exactly. And also, on immigration in particular, Australia has, sort of some reputation for having been extremely strict around boat arrivals and asylum seekers. So that adds a generalised tenor.
Everyone loves neighbours.
It must mean something really, really strict.
Yeah.
And maybe sunshine.
All right, let's have another question. Now, we've done Canada, we've done Australia. Now we're off to Devon.
Hi, Matt et al. Now we are in election madness proper. I keep hearing MPs who are being interviewed talk about what people tell them on the doorstep. Since being of voting age, I have lived variously in St Albans, Herts, Baldock, North Herts, Wheathampstead, Herts, Leinster, Herefordshire, Aberdeen, Grampian and Barnstaple, Devon. Typically, I've lived in large villages or market towns, or in the case of St Albans, on the edge of a city. I have never ever been canvassed by any political party on the doorstep. Is this because I've lived in rural areas? Don't the opinions of people in villages count? Please can the panel explain how canvassing works? Thanks. Helen in Devon.
Helen in Devon. It sounds like Helen's been on the run, living in all those places. Interesting this, because we sort of talk about, is it just because St Albans is, that's like changed hands and things, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, you're certainly pretty unlikely to get canvassed if you live in a really safe seat. It's much more likely to happen if you are in a place that is contested, because both parties will be out. So I did, as I mentioned before, I went canvassing in Eastbourne a couple of weekends ago, and we were there all day, and maybe I knocked on 100 doors and maybe spoke to 20 or 30 people, because I don't know, most people are out most of the time, and the ones who are in often look you up and down and then decide not to open the door. So it's actually quite hard, even if you do like a really concerted effort with dozens and dozens of canvassers, and to reach, what's it going to be, 50,000 doors over a constituency in the course of an election campaign? It's just basic maths.
Yeah, and I suppose, Danny, it's just very labour intensive, but in the key areas it does work. Otherwise, parties wouldn't keep doing it.
But the people who are doing this, that they're just volunteer. I remember my brother very kindly came out and he's not sort of exceptionally political, but he came out very kindly to canvass for me once in an election, and he rang on the door of somebody who said to them, "You only ever come round at election time." And my brother was really startled. He said, "Well, when else did you want me to come round? I've got a job." And he was startled at the idea this person expected him to sort of just come round in the middle of the week for no reason whatsoever. And also, Anthony was doing this out of the kind of kindness of his heart, and that people have got to go and do this. So people have a sort of expectation that if I, as a candidate, didn't get someone to knock on their door, it means because I didn't care about their opinion. But really, it's just because there are limits to the number of people you can get to go out on the street and knock on doors.
And that's why when we talk about particularly local elections, you lose, if you don't have councillors, you lose the people who'll be inclined to go and do that in a general.
But the good question was, how does it work, right? So the answer is you're trying to find out where your supporters are, so that on election day you can go and knock on the door and get them to come, and you're also trying to introduce the candidate You're trying to demonstrate that you care, but as Polly says, it's basic maths. It's just very difficult, particularly with declining numbers of political party members. It's just very difficult to knock on enough doors. You try as hard as you can, and often as you may be canvassed, and then the person was out. One of my relatives worked for Conservative Central Office and had sort of taken a day off, and then was really embarrassed to be canvassed on his own doorstep by Philip May. Mathematically, was quite unlikely.
Just before we wrap up, because we've had several questions on this, Jeff says, mad as it might sound, is the best hope for the Tories to mitigate the impending disaster for Rishi Sunak to resign and Penny Mordaunt to lead them into the election. What do you think, Polly? Good idea?
No.
Danny?
I did. It's not going to happen, and it's not a piece of advice, useful piece of advice. I think at this point it would look chaotic. I'm not sure at any point it would have been an improvement. The Conservative Party made its big mistakes when it appointed 2 prime ministers in a row that could not do the job, and I don't think anything after that was going to help all that much. My view is that Rishi Sunak is somebody who can do the job, but the Conservative Party were below the waterline before he took over.
Well, there we are. Well, maybe we'll see what happens if Penny Mordaunt puts in a good showing tonight.
But it's that, the Labour attack it's more chaos under the Conservatives versus stability under Labour, right? And so,
changing your leader in the middle of the campaign,
changing your leader in the middle
vibe.
of that is chaos. But there may be defections still to come to reform.
Yeah,
because the candidate deadline hasn't passed, so it's not too late, and that would really scare some people.
Stand by, everyone. Thank you very much for that. We got through some. We never quite get through as many as we hope. But if you want to send in a question, you can email howtowin@thetimes.co.uk or send us a voice note 0333 003 2353. That was How to Win an Election with me, Matt Chorley, Polly Mackenzie, Danny Finkelstein, and Peter Mandelson, wherever he is in the world.